Hello and welcome. I am Humphrey Hawksley, your host for the next hour and a bit on a compelling and intractable issue that has been with us for more than 70 years. Our discussion, exploring a European role in the search for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Now, we know the main players, China, Russia, Japan, the United States. Several European countries, including Britain and Sweden, are part of the United Nations command that oversees the demilitarized zone between the North and the South. But what more can Europe do to bring a permanent peace? To seek answers, we have a fantastically expert panel: Sussex University's Kevin Gray, UPF Korea's Byeong Cheol, from Sweden's Institute for Security and Development Policy, Niklas Swanström. Each a real specialist in their fields will speak for 7 minutes. I will challenge them on anything that is unclear, and you, our audience, can hold them to account at the end. But before they take the floor, two leaders of the Universal Peace Federation will give us the canvas and the background on which we will debate. So first, please welcome Dr. Charles Yang, Chairman of UPF International. Dr. Yang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, Ambassador for Peace, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Greetings from Korea. Thank you for joining this conference despite your busy schedules. This is a part of an ongoing series of programs UPF is holding around the world to bring attention to the issue of peace on the Korean Peninsula. Especially, I would like to express my gratitude to the panelists who have graciously attended as speakers. I appreciate your participation in this program to address concerns facing my homeland, the Korean Peninsula, which unfortunately remains one of the last remnants of the Cold War. As you know, the peninsula was divided almost 80 years ago by the superpower victors in the World War II. Korea was liberated from 36 years of Japanese rule on August 15, 1945. It's the end of World War II. To facilitate the disarmament of the Japanese forces, the Soviet Union entered the north, and the United States entered the south of Korea, divided by the 38th parallel. In 1948, under Soviet influence, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, was established in the north, while the Republic of Korea, ROK, centered around the free democracy, was set up in the south. Less than 2 years later, in June 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, sparking the Korean War for 3 years and 1 month. Following a UN Security Council resolution, 16 countries sent troops to support South Korea, and 6 nations sent medical teams, and 41 nations provided material support. All 63 countries supported South Korea. The UN forces totaled about 2.1 million personnel, with American troops comprising about 1.8 million of that number. North Korea received Air Force support from the Soviet Union and about 2.4 million troops from China. The Korean War was another global conflict following World War II, with casualties from both sides totaling almost 4 million. And creating 10 million separated families into North and South until now. The division was meant to be only temporary, but Korea became a victim of the Cold War that followed, with the North controlled by the Communist Soviet Union and the South by the Democratic United States. The background of the division between North and South Korea has a deeper origin. However, it lies in the ideological confrontation that has accompanied human development since ancient times. Tracking back through history, we can see that two contradictory philosophies have been contending for dominance for centuries. These are rooted in Hebraism, which is theistic, and Hellenism, which is humanistic. These have evolved over time into democracy and communism, respectively, leading to the ideological confrontations of the Cold War and culminating on the Korean Peninsula as their final battlefield. The various divisions and conflicts that occur worldwide today between different camps, religions, and classes, including theism versus humanism, idealism versus materialism, conservatism versus progressivism, are represented in the ultimate confrontation on the Korean Peninsula. As European, I know you are all affected by the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I believe you are also deeply concerned about the war between Israel and Hamas. For peace-loving people, every conflict is deeply distressing. That is why we have to find the way to a permanent peace. Finding a solution to the conflict on the Korean Peninsula is part of that process. And I am grateful for your concern and interest in looking for a solution to this problem. It's a new vision of coexistence and harmony to emerge in Korea. It could serve as an ideological indicator, a model for unified world, and a starting point for true peace. Thus, the unification of the Korean Peninsula is a global issue, symbolizing the unification of the communist and the democratic world, the complete end of the Cold War, and the gateway to permanent peace. Ladies and gentlemen, recently South Korea has achieved the rank of 7th in terms of global competitiveness and 5th in military power. The GDP ratio between South and North Korea has reached 61 for individual per capita, 30 to 1. South Korea can learn much from Germany's successful reunification case. So I look forward to hearing your views on this important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Charles Yang, remnant of the Cold War, 10 million separated families, contradictory philosophies. So to corroborate and expand on those thoughts, please welcome the introductory remarks from Dr. Katsumi Otsuka, the chair of UPF Europe and the Middle East. Dr. Otsuka, share with us your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Humphrey, for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody, distinguished speakers and dear UPF friends. I'd like to thank you for attending this webinar on the Korean Peninsula organized by the UPF UK. It is an unexpected blessing to have Dr. Charles Yang, UPF World President, to this conference. Dr. Charles Yang, thank you very much for being together with us today. Dear friends, undoubtedly, future historians and experts on the Korean Peninsula will record 2023 and 2024 as a historic turning point of the Korean Peninsula issue. It is because that the North Korea's supreme leader made it clear at the end of the year 2023 that South Korea was a hostile state. And he even declared to abolish his pursuit for the peaceful reunification. Having abandoned the legacy of his grandfather and father, where is that leader planning to lead the country? Even in South Korea, the enthusiasm for the reunification is sharply weakening. It feels as if the division of the Korean Peninsula is becoming increasingly solidified. In this context, this webinar is of great interest and significance. It is very meaningful for us to discuss about the European role for the peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. I hope you will have a very fruitful time in this webinar, in this high quality conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Katsumi Otsuka, very much for that. North Korea is still declaring the South as a hostile state, peace initiatives abandoned. There have been times over the decades when they've been close, they've fallen apart, but we're now not in a good place. Our first panelist, Professor Kevin Gray, Head of International Relations at Sussex University and a Fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC. His laser focus over his career is on East Asia. He is widely published and most recently the co-author of North Korea and the Geopolitics of Development. Kevin Gray, Europe's role in those geopolitics and the Korean Peninsula. Tell us what you know.
Thank you very much. So, I mean, just very briefly to answer the question, I think, yes, there is a role for Europe to play within the Korean conflict and also within the North Korean nuclear issue. I do think, however, that we do need to be very realistic about what the prospects are and what the challenges are. As Dr. Otsuka alluded to, we are in 2024 in a very in some ways unprecedented sort of climate in which I don't remember a time since I've been looking at these issues when certainly relations between the North and the South of Korea and between the North and the United States have been more fractious and tenuous. And of course, at the same time, the DPRK has found this kind of, well, I mean, it has a long history, but it's recently renewed its relations with Russia in this context of the increasing bloc formation of the so-called new Cold War. And of course, with Russia, the DPRK does not have to contend with all these uncertainties that it has with the United States and elsewhere with their electoral cycles and changes in policies. But then even if we look at Europe, I mean, if we're talking about, for example, the EU as an organization, as a supranational organization, it doesn't have really a good record, I think, in terms of its approach to North Korea. Officially termed critical engagement, I mean, at least since the early 2000s, the emphasis has been on the critical, not on the engagement, and it's pretty much aligned itself with the United States and relied on sanctions as a tool of dealing, if you like, with North Korea. And as we can see, as we know, this has not been particularly successful. And of course, things are getting more and more challenging with the Russia-Ukraine war and the fact that the DPRK has become, by most reports, a significant supplier of arms to Russia. It is not generating a great deal of goodwill within Europe, certainly not within the EU. So those are some of the challenges. And of course, there are also challenges about what kind of deal, if we're talking about denuclearization, is feasible with the DPRK. In the blurb for this event, there was some reference to the precedent of the JCPOA with Iran as being a potential way forward with the DPRK. But of course, the DPRK and Iran are in quite sort of different situations where the DPRK, by most reports, has numerous nuclear warheads already, right? A much more difficult situation to kind of reverse and move along towards denuclearization. And also, you know, I mean, certainly, as with the JCPOA, I think there's a role that Europe can play in carrying some of the you know, the back channels, the kind of negotiations that would be needed to reach a deal. But ultimately, you know, the carrots that need to be held out to the DPRK is going to include the lifting of sanctions. Now, the EU, of course, has its own sanctions, but they're not nearly as significant as those that have been imposed by the United Nations Security Council. And with the US as a permanent member, that's going to have to involve the US in the formation of any deal. Although, as with the case of Iran, of course, a deal that could be conceivable under a Trump administration, for example, could be a way of kind of ensuring and protecting against a subsequent change of administration towards, you know, an administration that's is not so keen on this deal. So there are obvious advantages to that kind of deal. There's a lot of uncertainties there, and I want to be optimistic about the possibilities, but of course we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about what North Korea's sort of red lines are, for example, how serious it is about regarding South Korea as a hostile state and giving up on the goal of improvement of relations with the US. And so that's where Europe's role really comes in, I think, in terms of leading the kind of behind the scenes, the track 1.5, track 2 negotiations, which will be precisely about that, about seeing what the room for maneuver is. And of course, Europe has a good record in that regard. At the level of the individual states of some of the individual states of Europe. So I think there's certainly a potential to see what is the reality and what is the room for maneuver behind the official rhetoric, which is coming from the DPRK, which does seem quite bleak and closing with possibilities. Now, that's much of that is related to North Korea's nuclear program, but of course that's not the only issue. One other thing I would mention, where I think Europe can certainly play a role, is in the area of humanitarian assistance and aid, and I think most, if not all, of the humanitarian NGOs that have a presence on the ground, or at least did until the pandemic, were European. At the moment, none of those have been able to re-enter the DPRK. Presumably, there are going to be some very difficult and complex negotiations about how that will happen. First of all, the UN organizations would need to re-enter. There would need to be an assessment, a joint needs assessment carried out by those organizations before these other humanitarian organizations can get back into the country. So there's some kind of difficult negotiations that will have to take place, and of course the DPRK will have to formally request that those organizations re-enter the country, and there'll be debates about the size of the in-person presence on the ground, and also a very conversation or a challenge within Europe that because of the huge needs in Gaza and in Ukraine, how do we also emphasize the need for humanitarian assistance within the DPRK as well, in a context in which there's already quite a lot of fatigue amongst donors vis-a-vis the UK. So just to sum up then, I would say yes, there's definitely a role, and it's based on Europe's experience in terms of its relations with the DPRK historically, but also we shouldn't shy away from some of the very significant challenges. So I will leave it there, and happy to hear questions.
Kevin, thank you very much for that. Could you just ground us in a couple of sort of historical points, I guess, is that you mentioned the Iran agreement, but there was the framework agreement, wasn't there, in the 1990s that was aimed at preventing North Korea getting a nuclear program, and that was abandoned under the Bush administration. Iran has gone through a similar thing. I know they're different, but similar. So why should North Korea trust anything that's written down if an American election would then bring in an administration that tears it up?
Yes, I mean, so the problem is trust is a really significant issue, and there was a lot of acrimony over the agreed framework because the US regarded the North Koreans as breaking that framework, but the North Koreans also regarded the US as not having delivered what it had supposed to have delivered, partly because of the change in political climate in the US and the balance of political forces. So in some ways, I mean, the JCPOA was actually a kind of a response to that, to make commitments much clearer if one side of the deal didn't deliver on what it was expected to deliver. So it provided a lot more clarity for that, and then we see that in the fact that the US under Trump sort of was very skeptical of that, but because of the way the deal was set up, it managed to keep that going. So I think in some sense the JCPOA addressed the deficiencies of the agreed framework, and that's probably it's something that could theoretically be applied in the case of North Korea.
And just a very quick one. You talked about Russia and China, of course, we know about. How are they working together with this unlimited relationship that they have now on carving out influence in the DPRK, or are they not?
Yeah, I mean, we don't see a lot of what's going on behind the scenes. I think it depends what you mean by influence. I mean the DPRK is a sovereign state, and it's always had a first sense of independence. I guess the influence comes to the fact that China, of course, has certain levels of economic engagement with North Korea, and is a lifeline to the North Korean economy. And the DPRK, I mean, we can see in the way that the DPRK has sort of vetoed United Nations, I think it was General Assembly resolutions on the Ukraine war. So the DPRK has given Russia diplomatic
but it's not likely to be a sort of a competitive rival ground for the two authoritarian powers. They can...
I mean, that's the way it worked in the past, right? In the 1960s, when you had the Sino-Soviet split, there was a certain degree of competition between the two countries, but the competition is not like that today. So I don't think this competitive edge. I mean, of course, they both have different approaches. I think China is still not fully willing to completely, lean towards Moscow and support it because China still wants to maintain its relations with other parts of the world. So that the competitive dynamic is not what it was, and I've not really seen any particular evidence that is emerging, but it could do it, and it could be hiding behind it. It could be happening behind the scenes.
Kevin Gray, Professor Kevin Gray, thank you very much for that. Stay with us. Our next speaker panelist is the Senior Research Fellow for UPF in Korea, Dr. Byeong Cheol, whose speciality is what we've been talking about, security in Northeast Asia, with a focus on that North Korean nuclear weapons program. His work also includes spells with the Future Consensus Institute and Seoul National University. So with the big powers vying for influence on the Korean Peninsula, how can Europe make it any better and safer? Byeong Cheol, give us your argument.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. Today, I'm going to touch three key questions. Firstly, the current policy shift of the DPRK. Secondly, a peace treaty issue between two Koreas. Finally, a European role in the search for peace on the Korean Peninsula will be discussed. At the end of 2023, North Korea announced it abandoned one Korea policy. Therefore, expressions such as South Korea, kinship, and unification have been disappeared from North Korea's official publications. This means North Korea's policy shift from one Korea policy to two states on the Korean Peninsula. So North Korea's two states narrative is a terrible news to the South Korean people, those who are eager to unify two Koreas. So some people criticize the current Yoon Suk-yeol administration because they believe Yoon Suk-yeol administration's hostile policy toward North Korea has drove North Korea to the war. On the other hand, others pay attention to North Korea's motivation. In fact, most Korean people consider North Korea's policy shift as a signal for Kim Jong-un to strengthen his control over North Korea. For example, it seems obvious Kim Jong-un regime regard the cultural influence of the Korean wave as a risk factor undermining the regime's stability. This might be one of crucial reasons which led Kim Jong-un to abandoning one Korea policy. Moreover, a recent close relation between North Korea and Russia seems to make Kim Jong-un to be more confident. He may believe it would be easier for North Korea to become de facto nuclear state with Russia's assistance. Anyway, most Korean people concerned the current situation seems to make the unification of the Korean Peninsula more difficult. However, Universal Peace Federation's goal is very clear, that is, to build peace on the Korean Peninsula and eventually achieve the reunification of two Koreas. So, from the UPF perspective, it seems important for both the North and the South to step back from their current headstrong policy positions. That is, Kim Jong-un should come back to the negotiation table with the US and South Korea, and the Yoon Suk-yeol administration also needs to cool down its tough and harsh attitude toward North Korea. Nevertheless, it seems unlikely this could happen in the near future. Anyway, UPF has made great efforts to build peace on the Korean Peninsula and to reunify the two Koreas with a global network. So UPF will continue this kind of efforts by persuading for both government and civil society to build peace on the Korean Peninsula. In relation to the peacemaking process on the Korean Peninsula, the issue of a peace treaty has been apparent in recent years, so we also need to examine this issue. After the end of the Korean War in 1953, armistice agreement was signed among nations involved. However, armistice means just a temporary ceasefire. Two Koreas never signed a peace treaty each other and are still technically at war. There are a couple of obstacles which disturb a peace deal between two Koreas. Firstly, the North insisted to sign a peace treaty with the United States, not with South Korea. This creates a complicated situation because South Korea do not agree with North Korea's suggestion. Secondly, the North Korean nuclear program is also another big hurdle to reaching a peace agreement. Honestly, it is difficult to imagine South Korea would accept a peace deal under a situation North Korea is threatening South Korea with nuclear weapons. Regarding a peace treaty, South Korea should be the player directly involved. Even though North Korea shows persistence, South Korea should go hand in hand with United States. Moreover, we shouldn't give up joint efforts to dismantle North Korean nuclear weapons. Not only both US and South Korea, but also European nations need to improve diplomatic relations with North Korea. In particular, European nations could also be an honest broker, as they were in nuclear deal between US and Iran in 2015. Therefore, with respect to a European role in the search for peace on the Korean Peninsula, most of all, in my view, solid diplomatic support by European nations would be most important. For example, European nations need to back up South Korea's position to dismantle the North Korean nuclear program and contribute to promoting better relations between the North and the South. So it might be better for European nations to reopen diplomatic relations with Pyongyang as much as they can and as soon as possible. This kind of support could result in the open door policy of North Korea, and this may eventually contribute to promoting a peaceful atmosphere on the Korean Peninsula, even if it takes a long time. I'd like to also suggest European nations should increase more their ODA distribution, I mean official development assistance distribution, to help the North Korean people. Even though nuclear program is a serious issue, we must think of all the starving people in North Korea. In short, European nations do not only have to develop diplomatic relations with North Korea, but also need to play as an honest broker in dealing with the nuclear issue and a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much for listening attentively. Thanks again.
Dr. Byeong Cheol, thank you so much for that. Just a couple of thoughts came to my mind as you were talking. You referenced again the Iran treaty agreement, which was broken, and the honest broker element there. Europe's a changing sort of entity, really, the European Union people think of. Would it be more effective for bilateral intervention or relationships with the North Korean government rather than the European Union one?
I mean, a bilateral relationship is it's very difficult to make a significant negotiation in case of making negotiation in bilateral relations, because one of them, if one of them go out from the room, the negotiation will be broken. We witnessed this case in Hanoi summit between the US and North Korea. So in my view, the third party's role would be important in this case. So the European nations could play as an honest broker, as they did in the negotiation between US and Iran. That's my opinion.
And one other element on the reunification or the unification element, if it happens, two of the issues, one of that you referred to was the dismantling of the nuclear program, but there's also the futures of the elite, their pensions, their houses, their status, that they would be terrified to lose. Anybody is with an authoritarian regime. Has Europe put a lot of thought to that? Is there a scenario within the European Union of how that could unfold?
Sorry, I couldn't catch you.
Does Europe or any country in Europe have a scenario whereby you would have as smooth as possible unification on the Korean Peninsula? And the two elements that you mentioned, one was the nuclear program, how to dismantle that, but the second one is to give security to the elite, the people that run it now, their pensions, their homes, their futures, and their status.
Actually, geologically, the Europe is very far from the Korean Peninsula. So, it might be very difficult for European nations to have the reunification between two Koreas. However, I'd like to emphasize the diplomatic role of European nations in relation to the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. So even though European nations could be difficult to take part in the North and South relations, but I think it is difficult to involve directly, but it could be for European nations to be a honest broker in every field between the two Koreas.
The honest broker, and of course Europe, as much as any region in the world, is familiar and has experience with disputed borders and hostility and changing fault lines and that sort of thing. Thank you so much, Dr. Moon, for that. Our final speaker is Dr. Niklas Swanström, Executive Director, Institute for Security and Development Policy from Sweden. His main areas of expertise are conflict prevention, conflict management, regional cooperation, everything that this Korean conundrum is about. Chinese foreign policy and security in Northeast Asia. He's widely published, and among his many publications. One of his ongoing book projects is entitled East Asia Security Cooperation, Walk the Walk and Talk the Talk. So with Europe in our frame of discussion, Niklas Swanström, tell us, how do we do that?
Well, I wish I knew, but I will try to give a bit of, and I seem to have a bit of bad connection, so please let me know if you can't hear me. But I do think, as been noted, that the European role is potentially very significant. It could be very significant. North Korea has reached out to Europe on multiple occasions, and is doing that even today. Even if it's also basically has refused to let European states open up their embassies in Pyongyang. Because I also think that when I speak to my North Korean friends in Pyongyang and here in Europe, I think there's a realization among them that they understand that the engagement with Russia that we have today is at best midterm. Shorter midterm. The Russian war machine is starting to rebuild. The production is getting better in Russia itself. So they know that they're not going to play that pivotal role in the future, and therefore they are seeking to expand. But the question is, does Europe have the capacity to do this? This is especially in the shadow of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The interest from Europe, I mean, I think we have to be honest on this, is on Ukraine, especially among countries like Sweden and Finland, that traditionally has been very much engaged. We focus on Ukraine to a large extent, and then of course we have Middle East. We thank God the response from Israel today was very modest, and I think we have to be grateful for that. That is a priority in many European states. And that also drains a lot of the financial resources, humanitarian resources, again, especially in Finland and Sweden, who just joined NATO. We will focus much more on NATO and the regional context, and therefore the Korean Peninsula becomes much less important. But if Europe would be able to take that role, there is a lot of possibilities. North Korea has an interest, despite its contact with Russia. It wants to balance China as well. The problem we have is that North Korea knows that time is on its side, or at least they think so. They don't need to engage in a dialogue and discussion today, especially if it's threatening their national interests. And denuclearization is definitely one of these national interests. They're not going to engage in any dialogue that forces them towards denuclearization. And they also have a very strong expectation when it comes to President Trump. Right now, they're waiting for the re-election of President Trump. And I think the bets are to a very high extent in Pyongyang on President Trump. And that also complicates things. So they're probably going to keep the pot boiling with engagement with Japan, with Europe, and that it's not really going to be allowing potentially for a true engagement. And I think we have to be, I'm a tad pessimistic of the short-term possibilities here. On the other hand, there are things that we can do. And I mean, before here, it was mentioned, 1.5 track diplomacy, academic exchanges. The North Koreans are very much engaged in this. We have a constant inflow of North Koreans at our institute, not during the pandemic, of course. This is, but the North Koreans are willing to engage in these sort of 1.5 track diplomacy events. But it's not going to be satisfactory. satisfactory to many people. Many people want to see a quick solution. I don't see a quick solution in the making, especially then with the demand from the outside and the West, a very legitimate demand of denuclearization. But North Korea is, this is putting them back. And I think what we need to create is really a Helsinki process of type. The North Korean, despite that idea of the Helsinki process, because they know that that laid the ground for the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but maybe we can create an Arirang process, that takes the Korean characteristics into account, because we need to be able to move on other issues than denuclearization. We need to be able to move on issues of humanitarian assistance, environment, water issues, tangible issues that is maybe sort of moving under the surface and not touching the sanctions that much. So there are possibilities that I think that we should acknowledge, but it doesn't lead to resolution. This is, I think we need to think about the Korean Peninsula as a long-term process where engagement is important. And I do think that, just to mention a bit of the word on the naming of South Korea as a hostile state, we heard this already in 2015, 2016. And it wasn't really about South Korea as much as it was about the difference between North and South. The North Koreans realized that unification was no longer possible on an equal footing. They knew that South Korea was becoming so strong, economically, militarily, in every possible way, that unification would be under South Korean flag. So naming South Korea as a hostile nation enables Kim Jong-un to dispatch of his grandfather's and his father's legacy and putting the blame on South Korea. But I think over time, it is very much feasible to bring the South Koreans to the table with the North Koreans. But unification, I do remain a bit skeptical on that, simply because the differences between North and South, and as was mentioned here, how do you protect the leaders' assets? How do you protect their housing? How do you protect their future, the pensions, etc.? That's going to be extremely difficult, and the North Koreans know that. And that's why they have this two-state solution. But in this, I think Europe can be very helpful in bridging that sort of gap between the actors in this conflict. But I'll leave it at this, and I'm open for all the questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Niklas Swanström, very, very much for that. So your advocacy, as much as is possible in the short to medium term, is the sort of European soft power, like bringing the younger generation to your institute, and then they go back and with a different mindset. Is that your thinking?
Well, both and, I would say. I mean, what we recommend is to work with both the current leadership and the current decision makers, as well as the future decision makers. So yes, in one way, to work with the young generation, but also to engage the older generation, try to figure out what they want, where are the red lines, what can we do, and what can we not do, and then trying to identify low-hanging fruit that we can build trust with.
And your institute is actively doing that. Are there similar dozens, hundreds of institutes throughout Europe that are doing that?
I don't know anyone, but I hopefully they are. But
I know that there's quite a few here at some of the universities and colleges in the UK. What we don't know, of course, is what happens when they go back. So my next question to you is: we have Kim Jong-un and his family, this hereditary autocracy that has gone on. the regional, this elite that we've been talking about, are they all on the same page as him, or is there a division as to whether they should modernize or clamp down?
I think it's a huge division within North Korea. I mean, there's no opposition to Kim Jong-un, at least not publicly. But when you look at the KPA, the Korean People's Army, you look at the foreign ministry, you look at economic ministries, they all have their own agendas. The Ministry of Agriculture and Environment, so the differences are absolutely there. And priorities are vastly different between the different departments, but that is also an opportunity. I mean, this is also, for me, I think it's a way to engage people and to build things. So for me, the fact that North Korea resembles a normal state in many ways, in that sense, is actually, it's not bad.
So just to, I mean, is that it's not just the individual governments, because the EU itself could be too cumbersome to actually do this in a micro way, but it's not only the governments, but also individual institutions and entities could forge these links. Is that right? In Europe?
Absolutely. But what you need is consistency. The problem I see is a lot of these institutions that try to foster engagement with North Korea will do it on an ad hoc basis. You need to do it continuously. And of course, the problem is funding. Governments come and they give you, when things are going well, they give institutions money to do this. And when North Korea tests a nuclear weapon, they pull the rug out of these institutions, so they lose that momentum. And of course, the North Koreans become suspicious about what is your commitment to this. So what we need is that long-term engagement.
It's consistency, because this is a 70-year-old problem with the same family in power. So we need to have that sort of consistency.
Yeah, and you can't solve this ad hoc. Yeah, no, and I think this is a big challenge, because governments are normally thinking in terms of 4 years. It's an election cycle.
Yeah.
But if we're going to do this on an institutional and policy level, sort of academic level, we need that consistency over 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and absolutely. I want to ask you a final question, but also bring that same question to the panel as a whole, and then bring in the questions from the audience. You mentioned Trump, and there's that historic photo op of him stepping across into North Korea and shaking hands and everything. Would that change, if he was elected, would that change the dynamics of this relationship? I mean, do they get on well? Can they share pizzas together that would stop things getting worse?
I think it would change the dynamic, but not necessarily in a good way. Because I think the North Koreans have high expectations on President Trump, and that he can bring something to the table. But I think we saw that in Hanoi. Trump believed the North Koreans would be able to compromise on his terms, and the North Koreans thought similarly that Trump would compromise to give North Korea something. So the expectations will be quite high if he's elected, and that can also lead to a lot of disappointment. So yes, that would definitely change the dynamic, but knowing or seeing Mr. Trump in action during 4 years, I'm not sure if it's going to be positive or negative. I think that's an open question.
Yes, thank you very much for that. Can we now open up the screen and to all the panelists? And we have a question. I want to return to the Trump thing in a moment, because I remember when Trump first came to power in 2017, President Obama left him a note saying that North Korea was the most important thing on his foreign policy agenda, and it dropped off it because of what Trump did, and we don't hear about it much anymore. So maybe he did do something. Maybe he has got a way. Has anybody got a thought on that? Kevin Gray.
Well, just on what you just said, I wouldn't characterize the Obama administration as being particularly proactive on the North Korean front. As you recall, the US policy at that time was called strategic patience, which was basically, let's sit around, we have these sanctions, let's sit around and hopefully the country will collapse, or they'll cave in. And I think that's been a big part of, that was a big part of the problem. And you see that kind of thinking sort of creeping back in under the Biden administration, where nothing much is really happening, and the country is just sort of, and the issue is just kind of left to itself. So and it's given North Korea a lot of time to build up its nuclear program, its stockpile, and all these kind of things. So I think that has been a failure for a long time. Just on that point on whether Trump is, what will happen if we have another Trump administration. I agree with Dr. Swanström's comments. I would just also add that one thing that will be different this time is that it won't be aligned with a pro-engagement administration in South Korea, which South Korea had played an important role in the whole peace diplomacy of 2018, 2019. But now you have a government in South Korea. I mean, the Yoon Suk-yeol administration is probably, I would say, more hardline even than the US and as we've seen with Japan. And a lot of this rhetoric about the hostile state and the nuclear rhetoric that's coming out of Pyongyang at the moment, it's being matched. It's part of a cycle with South Korea as well. And so one of the problems that the Washington was faced with was that there was increasing support within South Korea for South Korea to have its own nuclear deterrence. And Washington, there was this meeting and there was a Washington declaration, and where there was the US made a stronger, explicit commitment to extend the nuclear deterrence to South Korea and to have South Korea as part of this, I forget what it's called now, a consultation group or a deliberation group. And that has made the North Koreans even more aware of this, what they call a hostile environment. So there's a real negative loop that's going on, I think, within inter-Korean relations. And for Trump then to come in within this context, it's not going to be as easy, I think. And
try to cut a real estate deal on hotels on the ski slopes or something.
That's right. Yes.
Dr. Byeong Cheol, there's a question directly for you, but if you could just talk for a couple of seconds on this Trump scenario. Would it be a good or a bad thing for what we're talking about? You are muted.
I know there would be a high expectation for a new Trump administration because North Korea and most people want to make a negotiation between the US and North Korea in relation to dismantlement of the nuclear weapons, because this negotiation would bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. However, I think it might be very controversial whether the two players, Trump and Kim Jong-un, would trust each other, because they would almost make a good deal in Hanoi, but eventually it failed. So even though there would be a high expectation for a new Trump administration, it would be not easy to make a good deal between North Korea and Trump. That's my opinion.
Too many obstacles to get things across the line. So you've got Biden is a little bit too far off. Trump will go in steaming, and then nobody quite knows what will happen. Can I ask you, this is from Thomas Kazowski, particularly for you, Dr. Moon, but I'd like the other panelists to chip in afterwards. Does DPRK still trust the former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland? Do they have any good foundation for diplomatic relations? Interesting point. Dr. Moon?
Yeah. As far as I know, the DPRK has no good relations with the former Warsaw Pact countries. At the moment, North Korea has been really isolated from the previous alliances. So North Korea they just live with a assistance from China and from Russia. So I don't think at the moment, at this stage, North Korea would make a good relations with Warsaw-head countries.
Niklas Swanström, any sort of unique selling point in the former Eastern Bloc?
Well, I mean, I agree. There's not that huge trust with, but it still is significant that the U.S. Special Representative for the Korean Peninsula, when he visited Europe the last time, just a few days ago, he went first to Romania, then to Poland, and then to Sweden. So it seems that the United States, at least, seem to hope that the Poles and Romanians or other sort of former Eastern Europeans have a leverage or some sort of influence. Okay. But I agree. I think that it is very limited. The two countries that would have some influence is Russia and China. But I still think that North Korea is fiercely independent-minded. Not even China and Russia has. I think we exaggerate the impact actually China has on North Korea even. So I think there's. I'm actually coming out with an article on that within short, but the conclusion is in essence that don't exaggerate China's influence on North Korea.
China's influence. Yeah. So what is what can Europe do? Good question. We have Kevin Gray. I've got a question coming in for you, but just give us a very quick answer. East European Bloc. Any specific influence that you know of?
No. I mean, I agree with what's been said, and even during the time of the Cold War, there's plenty of sort of historiographical literature that's come out to show how tense relations were between the sort of Eastern European and the Soviet bloc countries and North Korea. Formally a sort of fraternal relationship, but in practice not really, and that points to the fact that North Korea was just a very different kind of state. It was not a Soviet satellite state. It was built on a sort of a national anti-colonial revolution, has a very strong sense of independence. And then, of course, there's the issue that the Eastern European countries tend to be very enthusiastic members of NATO, whereas that the so-called expansion of NATO into East Asia is one of kind of North Korea's key gripes. So yeah, yes.
Yes, no, that's a good point. So it technically could be a historical ideological thing, but in practice it doesn't exist. And a question, this is from Alan Silito, in a possible united Korea, is it realistic to assume that there would be the same political system in both parts, or could we see a Korea with two different political systems? Kevin Gray, quickly.
Well, a united Korea with different political systems, that was Kim Il-sung's kind of blueprint for reunification under a confederation. So it's not that it hasn't been thought about, but I mean, I think in unification in any meaningful sense is a unification of political systems, because the one thing that unification has to overcome is the fact that you have two different kind of the two different societies that define themselves in relation to each other. And your question earlier, Humphrey, about what would happen to the elites, I mean, that's also crucial to whether we have anything that can be meaningfully called unification. And the fact that I personally think of North Korea as a system of a coalition of vested interests, and what really maintains unity in North Korea is simply a shared understanding that they want the North Korean system to continue, because that's where their interests are.
Of course, this is what we discovered, or the politicians discovered in Iraq when they stripped away the elite's privileges. They got a war that has not yet completely ended. Kevin, there's another one for you, but I want to take it around the camera. Let me put it to you. This is from Thomas Kozowski again. Are not Russia and China acting actually as the spoilers to the negotiation process as regards denuclearization and peace building? Are they spoilers? Or are we spoilers?
I don't, it depends how you think of them. How did they become to be spoilers? I suppose in one sense, yes, because they provide an alternative kind of sort of, you know, the sort of allies that North Korea can turn to for economic assistance and these kind of things. And so I suppose you could argue that, well, if that wasn't there, then North Korea would have no choice. But then that's just the way the world is. That's just the sort of geography and the geopolitics of the region. But negotiations in a more direct sense, I mean, there weren't really any negotiations going on to spoil after Hanoi, right? So I think simply what's happened is up until 2017, China and Russia, of course, they were, as P5 members, they signed up to all the UN resolutions about denuclearization and condemning, you know, North Korea's so-called provocations. But since then, I mean, I wouldn't say that they're happy with the North Korean nuclear program, but I think they just think there are bigger issues at stake. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't personally describe them as spoilers, but
not spoilers.
Yeah.
Dr. Moon, who is the spoiler? In 70 years, this problem is intractable and unresolved. If Russia and China aren't the spoilers, as Kevin Gray says, who is the spoiler?
I don't know. I don't know. Who is spoiler?
I mean,
yeah,
is it more useful for the superpowers to have North Korea as it is, as this sort of unpredictable buffer state?
Well, in relation to dealing with North Korea, it's quite difficult because the North Korea diplomacy is very, how to say, very different from the normal states. So it is also very difficult to identify who would be the spoiler in relation to negotiating with North Korea. Anyway, it is more important thing is to make a good negotiation with North Korea. So not only superpower such as the United States of America, but also European nations, the supranational institution could also engage in the negotiation with North Korea. So this could make a good result in the search for peace in the Korean Peninsula.
And thank you. And Niklas Swanström, I mean, Russia and China, are they the spoilers, or is there a spoiler in this?
Well, I mean, I don't think they are spoilers. So you can, as was said before, they can be seen as spoilers if we see our views as, you know, the most important. But the reality is that China has different expectations. They have different interests. So from their point of view, they're only protecting their own national interests. So they're not spoilers in that sense. But I think the big spoiler is unrealistic expectations. We have come in with extremely unrealistic expectations from all sides without really having a dialogue. We talk, but we don't listen to each other. And what we need is a dialogue that really could start looking at and saying, what do you want? How can we reach your view instead of looking at what do I want to accomplish? So denuclearization is, yeah.
Sorry, could I bring, because there are two questions along the lines that you're arguing. Can I put them to you and then go around the panel again? This is from Yoshihiro Yamazaki. Except for this type of forum that we've got today, the Korea issue faces rather little attention in Europe, apart from your institute, it seems. Do any of the panelists have any advice on how to raise European attention or interest in the Korean question for its peace or eventual unification? And Johan Brunbauer says, how would you describe the advantages for European countries to have better connections to North Korea? Can we do it better than, say, the Americans, the Chinese, or the Russians? Niklas, just give us your thoughts.
Well, I think we can do it better because there's less interest. We have, it's an issue that is not so, it's a bit more distant for us, which means we have no national interest really, apart from peace and security and international trade and all that. So in that sense, but it doesn't mean we have that magical formula that can sort of solve this. But I do think that Europe can play a role in that sense, bringing in, starting dialogues, building processes. But in the end, the people who have to solve the issue is really United States, North Korea, South Korea, because they are the active parties. But the Europeans can definitely be there assisting platform building, process building, but we're not going to solve it though. I think that we have to be realistic on that.
Well, it has to be solved by Kim Jong-un, the Kim family, and those interests. But there's a question from Ewan Grant that I'd like to put as a final question to the panel. If you could just give us a concise, upsumming answer to it. A real eye-opener will come into the public domain at the end of the year about Russian influence penetration of Germany. What do you see might galvanize a united long-term European, that's the EU and the UK and everything like that, to Pyongyang? Would Japan going nuclear speed this up? Or would, and I'll add this myself, Ewan doesn't say it himself, would South Korea going nuclear, maybe like Israel has done, change the dynamic? Let's have a final thought. Kevin Gray, give us you begin and we'll go round again.
It's difficult because I do feel that this sort of seeming limited interest, European interest in what goes on in Northeast Asia has long roots, and it's been going on for a long time. And even at the moment where you have all this nuclear rhetoric going on between the two Koreas and some very hardline language coming from Pyongyang, that it doesn't seem to be raising much concern in Europe when you've got Ukraine and Gaza, and it's even something like another nuclear test in North Korea. I don't even know that would really be enough.
Sorry, finish up. Yeah.
No. That's fine. But I think. But I think the kind of diplomacy and this follows on from Dr. Swanström's comments. I mean, this kind of track 1.5 diplomacy doesn't necessarily need to happen on the back of massive interest. This is something that happens a little bit behind the scenes, but I think it's really valuable in the sense that we don't really know what the North Koreans want at the moment, right? I mean, you look at their official rhetoric, and there are people, there was a paper by Robert Carlin and Rachel Min-Young Lee where they'd done this very fine-tuned analysis of North Korean media and said it's awful, they want war, but to actually get behind the scenes and talk to what people want, and not to create too many expectations on these kind of behind-the-scenes negotiations. I think that's something that Europe can probably play a really valuable role in.
That's a very good point. Dr. Moon, give us your final, concise, brief thought.
Yeah, I think individual country in Europe that does not have interest in relation to North Korea, as European Union need to engage in North Korean problem because there would be a superpower competition between China and America. So the Europeans' role would be more important. And also regarding the Japan's nuclear armament, I think it might be difficult to imagine the Japan Japan go to a nuclear state in the near future, because it's a very complicated diplomatic and international political matters. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. And just finally, in a few seconds, Dr. Swanström, we're talking about Japan and South Korea going nuclear now. That the war is a global thing, as is geopolitics. Give us a final thought.
Well, we need a crisis that trumps the war in Ukraine or the Middle East.
Okay.
I mean, never waste a good crisis, is what people say, but I'm not even sure if South Korea goes nuclear or Japan goes nuclear, would that trigger NPT? Is a danger? Yes, absolutely. That might increase the interest, but unfortunately, I think it needs to become worse before you're going to generate an interest from the European Union at large.
Thank you. That is an extremely realistic, I was going to say depressing, realistic thought. Thank you very
Sorry
much.
Sorry about that.
And now to sum up whether he agrees to conclude our discussion, we have Jacques Marion, a veteran UPF campaigner, Africa, China, Russia, Middle East, Eurasia, you name it. Jacques Marion has been there. Jacques, give us your wisdom.
Thank you, Humphrey. And the respected panelists, thank you very much for your very informative and interesting presentation and discussion. In closing, let me offer a few reflections, not as a scholar on world affairs, which I'm not, but as a member of an NGO, the Universal Peace Federation, which has given high priority to peace on the Korean Peninsula in the last decades. Unlike the United States, Europe's focus in Northeast Asia has been more on cooperation than on competition. But in today's context of two competing camps, China, Russia, North Korea on one side, the US, Japan, and South Korea on the other side, how can Europe contribute to peaceful solution to the conflict? With the war in Ukraine, Europe is in direct confrontation with Russia. North Korea provides weapons to Russia, and South Korea provides weapons to European nations. Can Europe in this context play the role of a mediator in the conflict in Northeast Asia? I'd like to draw attention to the question of trust building in relation with North Korea, which has been said is, I think, very significant in this matter. And I'd like to refer to the experience of a British scholar and politician, Glyn Ford, who as a member of the European Parliament was instrumental in developing the first large-scale humanitarian aid from the EU to North Korea during the times of famine earlier in this century. He visited North Korea, I think about 50 times, and was able to build relationships of trust with North Korean leaders at the highest level. And he's the one who initiated in 2004 the European Parliament's delegation for relations with the Korean Peninsula, which I think is a significant tool for European diplomacy in the Far East. He wrote actually several books on North Korea, including a recent one entitled Picturing the DPRK, which offers a window into North Korean life. Ford acknowledges that North Korea is a flawed and repressive state, yet he sees that there is a way to engage North Korean leaders, part of whom are desperate to modernize and end their isolation. This view resonates with us in UPF because our founder, Dr. Moon, when the Berlin Wall collapsed and the Cold War came to an end, seized the opportunity to go and meet with Kim Il-sung at that time at the risk of his life, and was able to engage him in opening a dialogue with the United States in 1991 and in the following years. Today, when we see the radical shift of policy announced by Kim Jong-un in regard to South Korea, breaking with the tradition of his father Kim Jong-il and grandfather Kim Il-sung, as has been said several times today, and who despite these two, Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung, who despite always provoking conflicts, never ceased to proclaim the unity of the Korean people and never considered the destruction of South Korea. So when we see Kim Jong-un's policy shift, we wonder whether it's still possible to talk anymore about peace on the Korean Peninsula. Yet, this position, as Ford suggests, by the way, is a position of weakness. And, it basically acknowledging that North Korea is weaker economically and militarily than South Korea and can only rely on nuclear power. Whereas the US, Japan, and South Korea are kind of locked into a radical confrontation with North Korea, isn't Europe still in the position to engage the North and in trust building and offer some alternatives that may satisfy their needs, North Korea's needs, whether in the area of agriculture or health or other ways of cooperation and assistance. I think that has been mentioned also by our panelists today. I'm raising that question, which I thought would be considered maybe utopian in current circumstances, but I can see that most of our panelists today, or all our panelists today, concur with this idea. And I think that Europe has such resources and that North Korea has such expectations from European nations. In any case, we in UPF pursue the initiative that was stated in our 2022 summit resolution in Korea as 2 states toward 1 nation, 1 peninsula, 1 people, 1 culture, considering that peace in Northeast Asia is essential to the world. As you know, many projects have been envisioned by UPF founders in support of this initiative, such as tunnel connections between Japan and Korea, or between the US and Eurasian continent and the Bering Strait. And these large projects, as well as many of the meetings we organize, such as this one, are meant to support this initiative. And despite the current tension, we believe that it is really an endeavor worth fighting for. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for your presentations today. Thank you very much, Humphrey, also for your moderation. Thank you.
Jacques, wonderful stuff. Soft power, trust, an alternative, and never stop trying for the endeavor. What a debate we've had. Thank you, Charles Yang, Katsumi Otsuka, our panelists, Kevin Gray, Byeong Cheol, Niklas Swanström, and Jacques for summing us up so brilliantly and with motivation, I would say. And thank you all for your questions. Sorry for those that we didn't have time to get to. Please keep an eye open on the UPF website for upcoming webinars on equally captivating and critical issues. We ask the difficult questions, seeking seemingly impossible answers, but we will get there. But from now, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and all at UPF, and those working behind the scenes to make this happen, stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Gray. Thank you, Dr. Moon. Thank you, Dr. Swanson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin.
Thank you, Robin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay. Goodbye. Thank you.